Take your Bibles, if you would, and turn to Proverbs chapter 17. Proverbs 17, if you would. And we'll be there in a few moments, Proverbs 17. Before we do, let me remind you, tomorrow is our day of prayer and fasting. And so hopefully you'll be spending some time with the Lord, one-on-one, in prayer and seeking God's face. And we'd appreciate you spending time, particularly praying for a day camp coming up and for our church, that God would have his way in our hearts and lives and through our ministry. Proverbs 17, we'll be there in a moment. This evening, we want to talk about the challenge of adult children and also the challenge of, if you're an adult, your parents, because, that works both ways. It can be a challenge if you're parenting adult children, and the challenge is also on the part of the child itself. So Proverbs 17, look at verse 6, if you would, please. Children's children are the crown of old men, and the glory of the children are their fathers. And so we're going to talk in a moment about this. Before we get into this particular verse and some truths about it, I wanted to ask you to think through some of the common challenges that people have in this kind of relationship. And we have a couple of them up here for you on the screen. Okay? So a couple of the common challenges. One of them are boundaries. That's a real challenge when it comes to adults, children, knowing where to draw the line, how firm to make the line, how clear to make the line. And when you're an adult child, knowing how to accept because boundaries work both ways, okay? For example, sometimes children who are grown and who have their parents still living, sometimes I have to be very careful about the boundaries they cross, even if their intention is to help their parents. There is some boundaries that you have to be careful about. That can be an issue. And then communication is a real challenge because often they're speaking Latin to people who don't understand Latin. I mean, you're not communicating. And one of the problems with the communication is that you're not around each other a lot. And so if there's a misunderstanding, if you don't have the atmosphere to bring to the forefront offenses, for example, and so are misunderstandings. You text something, you say something, and then you both go your ways, and you think everything's fine, and the other person is offended by it, but you're not around each other enough to know because of the way they come into the kitchen the next minute or whatever like this. So communication can be a real challenge. And then in this age of texting, it can be an extreme challenge. Remember this, texting should never be used for something that is emotional and significant or that is detailed, because it really becomes problematic, but communication is often a problem. And then understanding. Remember I mentioned to you this morning that part of the problem with children, the challenge with children is that children have no idea about life. They don't understand life, and so they've got to learn through these different phases, okay? So what happens, though, is often with the adult child, doesn't really understand what their parents are going through. And sometimes they think they do. Well, they've never been old. I mean, they're still in between 20 and 40. I'm just using that bracket. They're still in that bracket, so they don't really know what it's like to be 50 or 60 or 70 or above. They don't know what it's like, so understanding that can be a challenge. And then sometimes, because it depends how old the adult parent is, it's been so long since they were younger, they don't remember what it's like to be 20 or 30, and they don't remember their own maybe challenges they had with their own parents, okay? And they don't think through, well, are we just repeating generational difficulties in our relationships because I'm acting towards my adult child, and he's frustrated, she's frustrated, just like I was frustrated with my parents. Okay? And could that be happening? So understanding that is a real challenge. And then acceptance. And the challenge with acceptance is, the song we quote sometimes, you have to know when to hold them, when to fold them, and when to walk away, when to run. You have to know what you can accept and what you can't accept. You can't accept. There are some things they're just different. They do things differently, okay? Doesn't mean they're necessarily wrong or bad. They're just different. The other things are wrong and bad. And so you have to work through what you can or cannot accept. One of the common challenges, and I've done a couple of classes on counseling at 2 different Bible colleges or seminaries, and in the discussion we've had with those pastors who were preparing to counsel and so forth was, how do you handle it when you have Jack's your son, and instead of Jack and Jill come home on school break, or they come home from where they live, and Jack and Jill live together. They're not married, they live together, okay? So what do they do at your house? Okay, what do you do about that? How do you recognize that, or you deal with what's happening? You don't affirm it, but or accept it, but it's there. So what do you do? What do you accept? What you don't? And then to make matters more challenging, what if Jack doesn't bring Jill home, but Jack brings Jim home? Okay, and then what do you do? Okay, and so how do you handle that? Those are just legitimate challenges, and you got to determine what you can accept and what you cannot accept. Okay? For example, we had a situation one time in our family that we had an extended family situation where they wanted to come to our house and they wanted to act like they were husband and wife, but they weren't husband and wife. And so we couldn't allow that in our house. We weren't going to allow that in our house. But we have to, it's between me and us and the Lord, He's provided. We're not going to let that take place in our house. Okay? Well, they do it anyhow. That's a silly argument. People kill each other. They shoot each other. They abuse each other. What are you going to say? Well, don't worry about it. You can't do that. And so you got to work through what you can accept, what you can't accept, and then how do you communicate what you do accept and what you don't accept? Okay, that's a challenge. And then the other one that's really popular is anger. Because what happens is anger abides, and sometimes it can abide for a long time. And often what happens is as children move into adulthood, and particularly this anger issue really develops often among siblings as mom and dad are getting older, and they can envision for the first time a world without mom and dad. Often they can wind up becoming angry at mom and dad for things that either real offenses or imaginary offenses, or whatever, and so that can take place. So those are just some of the challenges that we've seen in our counseling ministry and just observing life, and you may observe others, but that's some I want to share with you, okay? Now, I'm going to give you 4 words tonight. Before we get to there, let's look at this verse again. I'm sorry, let's look at the verse again. Verse 6. Children are a crown of old men, and the glory of the children are their fathers. And there's 2 words, the word crown and the word glory. I want to give these to you, okay, for a moment, okay? First of all, the word crown, it means 3 things. It has the idea of recognition, the idea of reward, and the idea of responsibility. So those 3 words are associated with this particular Hebrew word in verse 6, that children are the crown of old men. Now, I just want to encourage you, if you're an old man, you say, well, how do you know if you're an old man? Well, you're older than somebody else around you. So if you're 20 and you're around a bunch of 17-year-olds, then you're the old man if you're a guy, okay? And let me encourage you to embrace being old. The whole idea of these things, these advertisements you see, well, be like you're 20. Well, that's, good luck with that, okay? Because, you get a certain number of candles. When you have enough candles, if they had all the candles on there, they have to call the fire department to blow them out, okay? I mean, when you get to that stage in life, the whole idea of saying, well, let's act like we're 20. Well, you're not 20. And you're not going to be 20. You may be 120, but if you're 120, you're not going to be quite like you were when you were 20, okay? It's just not going to happen, okay? And so let me encourage you to embrace where you are. And now, I'm not suggesting at all that people who get older should then just sit by the dock of the bay and watch the tide roll away. I think you should stay as active as you can and go as far as you can, as God would have you to go, in the life that God has for you. But it says here that children and children's grandchildren are a blessing, and it magnifies a crown. It recognizes the position. The point here, it recognizes the position that grandparents have. Grandparents have gotten a bum rap in many circles, but in some cases they deserve it. Because there are grandparents who have simply checked out of their role as grandparenting. Now, the role is a challenge when you are apart geographically. I know for our household, we have 8 grandchildren, seven, unless David and Marty have something to tell us. We have 7 grandchildren, okay? And but 5 of them are half a world away. So we constantly have to work at engaging in their life, okay? We can't be absentee grandparents even though we are thousands of miles away and we have limited time together, okay? We have to do our best to try to minister to them and reach out to them. But the grandchildren are a blessing and recognize the value and the responsibility that when they say the crown, there is a responsibility, not only a recognition and a reward, but also a responsibility. You have a responsibility to minister to your grandchildren. Now, is it wise for grandparents to drop everything and build the whole universe around their grandkids? Well, not usually unless there's extenuating circumstances. I mean, you have grandchildren and one of the spouses passed away, or there's some health issue, there's some crisis. Obviously, you'd have to be more involved than others, and you have to balance that out because you would not want to become so intrusive into their life that their life becomes dependent upon you, because that's not healthy for them, nor is it healthy for you, okay? And so forth. So you got to work all that out, okay? But also then you have the word in the verse, not only the word crown, but the word glory. And the word glory has 2 words to it, 2 meanings to it. One is rank, and one is renown. And the idea is that, watch what it says here now. It says, and the glory of children are their fathers. You see, the children, the grandparents, the adult bring, or the parents bring things to the table for the children, and the children are blessed by the accomplishment and the place of the father or the grandfather, in this case, that may be there. So I just want to magnify the importance of fathers and mothers, grandfathers and grandmothers, and children and grandchildren. They're all important, okay? Now, with that said, I'm going to give you 4 words, and Brother Jimmy's going to bring them on the screen here in a few moments. If you would, Brother Jimmy, I'd appreciate that. And listen, take your Bible before we give you the word and turn to the book of 2 Samuel, okay? Now, these 4 words are chosen, I could say at random, but I want to sound a little bit more thoughtful than that, not just at random, but they are 4 words that I've chosen to sort of summarize the issues we have dealt with in the issue and have observed in dealing with families who have been studying Scripture and families with adult children. In other words, these are challenges that grandparents often face, or parents, if their adult children don't have children, they're adult children. Now, you're in 2 Samuel chapter 13, okay? So turn to that, 2 Samuel 13, all right? And 2 Samuel 13, here's the first word. The first word is guilt. One of the great obstacles to overcome in parenting adult children is the sense of guilt that accompanies older life. And you say, well, why is that? Well, in part because you've lived longer, so you have a longer opportunity to do stupid stuff, okay? Now, there are 2 elements that come to play here. First of all, you've lived long enough to do more stupid stuff. And second of all, you have less chances to undo the stupid stuff you've done. Okay? You can't undo a lot of it. And so what happens often with parents of adult children is guilt becomes a driving force. Okay? Now, these words can have 2 sides to them. They can have the side from the parent to the child, and also from the adult child to the parent. But we're going to talk first of all from the grandparent to the adult child. Okay, so look at 2 Samuel 13, and you have the story, of course, that you're very familiar with chapter 11. You have David and Bathsheba. Chapter 12, God ringing his bell and him dealing with his sin. And then in chapter 13, you have the story of Ammon and his love for Tamar, his desire for her sexually, and how he forces himself upon her. And after he does that hideous behavior and forces himself upon her, verse 15 of chapter 13, is the summary of what happens when physical desire becomes outside of God's will and fulfilled that way. Verse 15, and Ammon hastened her exceedingly so that he hated her, wherewith he hated her, he hated her was greater than the love wherein he had loved her. And Ammon said unto her, arise and go. So Ammon hated her exceedingly so that the hatred that she had. So there's a tremendous change in the relationship now. He's forced himself upon her and she goes her way, okay? Now, look down at verse 20. And Absalom, her brother, this is the full brother of Tamar, said unto her, hath Ammon thy brother been with thee? Okay. But hold now thy peace, my sister. He is thy brother, his half-brother. Regard not this thing. So Tamar remained desolate in her brother's Absalom's house. But look at verse 21. But when King David heard of all these things, he was very wroth. And Absalom spake unto his brother Ammon neither good nor bad, for Absalom hated Ammon because he had forced his sister Tamar. Now what you have here is an acknowledgement that David knows what's going on, but from the passage here, David does nothing. He is paralyzed. Now I do realize that I am making an observation here. I'm not interpreting, but I'm observing something. I'm observing in chapter 12, you have a man, in 11, a man of great renown who sins a terrible sin that's known by everybody. In chapter 12, you have the judgment of God and the convicting power of God and the repentance of David. But now in verse 13, when the same kind of sin comes up, he becomes paralyzed. He doesn't respond. Now you know the storyline. What happens is Absalom winds up killing Ammon, and then he's away, flees, and David tries to get him. It doesn't work. But look at chapter 14 and look at verse 28. So by the time you get to chapter 14, verse 28, Absalom now is back home, and Absalom dwelt 2 full years in Jerusalem and saw not the king's face. What you have here is a man that is riddled with guilt and a man who is paralyzed by it, okay? So what you have to do, if you're a parent of an adult child, you have to confront whatever guilt there may be in your heart and life, okay? Now, I want to give you 3 things to write down, okay? I'm going to give you 3 references. We're not going to turn to them. I'm going to give them to you, and you can look at them at your leisure, okay? How do I respond and protect myself from this guilt that can paralyze me, okay? Well, letter A, write this down if you would. I have to deal with my guilt before God. I have to deal with my guilt before God. 2 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 9 through 10, says that godly sorrow works with repentance. And that if you have a guilt that is coming from God over an offense that you had toward your children growing up, or even once they became adults, and you feel guilty about it, the way you deal with it is by going to God and repenting of it and confessing it. And of course, forsaking it. All part of that idea, okay? In other words, if I am guilty before God, that first has to be resolved, okay? You have to resolve that. But letter B, you have to deal with it. Letter A is you deal with God. Second, you deal with the people that you've sinned against. Matthew 5, 23 and 24. You have to deal with the people that you sinned against, okay? Now, I mentioned to you this morning where the thing about Jonathan and his getting married and asking him about his, if you were in the second service, I believe it was, and asked about his honeymoon, do you have enough money? Once I made that wrong statement, I apologized. I said, would you please forgive me, okay? And I believe, I've at least recognized the fact that when we have failed our kids, we've tried to deal with the sin, okay? And so if you have sinned against the children, no matter what age they are, you need to deal with it as the Lord leads you, okay? Now, they don't know about the offense. That's a different thing. But if they know about the offense, you need to deal with that with them, okay? At some point, you sit them down. And what we recommend in our counseling ministry is what we call the table of grace. You've ever heard that? The table of grace. The table of grace is when you sit down with family members in particular, but you can use it for anybody, and say, you know what? I'd like to talk to you. But I'm going to need you to extend me grace to listen to me. And I'm going to ask you to extend me grace in forgiving me. And I want to share with you what I need to share with you. okay? And table of graces are great for that. Also, table of graces are great if you have a relationship with your adult kids that is very interactive and you're around each other a lot. You need to have that, particularly if you're living in the same location, same building, same house. I know Jonathan was at our house off and on for about 5 years, okay? They came home from South Korea the first time, and they'd gotten married, came back from South Korea. They had a little baby, a Yechan, and they were living in our house off and on for 5 years as they did mission work in raising support. They were at times, particularly in the early stages, they were at the house sometimes an elongated amount of time. Now, by that time, we had been empty nesters for quite a few years, and so we were used to our space. Now, can anybody give me a witness on that? You're used to your space. You used to life a certain way. And so I remember some things developed. I mean, it was just things when two families lived in the same space. And so I sat Jonathan down. I never forget the experience, okay? Because I sat him down, and I said, son, we need to talk. He looked at me with the saddest face and says, Dad, you want us to move, don't you? I said, no, son, I don't want you to. I didn't want them to move. I really didn't. I mean, eventually I did. I wanted them to go to Korea. But I mean, I didn't take him to raise for his whole life, And I wasn't raising him. We were just providing the apartment. So he was paying his own stuff. So I wasn't like, but still, it was just the way it was. So I said, no, but we need to talk. There's some things we need to talk about. And so what we did is we started having systematic times, and we didn't call them at that time tables of grace, but systematic discussions went basically like this. What about our relationship do we need to talk about? Are there anything, have I ignored you about something, ignored you? Is there something we need to talk about? Is there any problems? What's work? And we asked 3 questions. First of all, what's working? Second, what's not working? And third, what do we need to improve about the relationship? We call it the table of grace. We call it now. We didn't call it then, but that's what we do now when we talk to people and recommend it. Okay? But you have to talk it through because you have problems. Okay? And things happen. Okay? And so you have to work them through. And that dealing with the offense is important for adults with parents of adult children, not only when you go back to your childhood and say, well, maybe there's offenses back you need to deal with, but just in current real time. Because there are sometimes offenses between adults. Do you ever have trouble with another adult? I mean, not necessarily a family member, just a friend of yours. You have a misunderstanding, you hurt somebody's feeling, say something you shouldn't say, you got the foot and mouth disease, whatever. And so those kind of things happen. And when they do happen, you simply have to deal with them. Okay? So you deal with the guilt before God. Secondly, you deal with it with the others. And then thirdly, you deal with it by resting in God's grace. 2 Timothy 1, 12 to 14. You deal with it by resting in God's grace. In 2 Timothy 1, verses 12 to 14, Paul talks about his awful life before he was saved. But then about, persecuting the church. But then he says, but God, and I'm just paraphrasing these, but God's grace. I'm now saved by his grace. I am redeemed by his grace. So he acknowledged his past, but rested in God's grace. Now, that's been an encouragement to me because I look back at raising Jonathan and David, and there's about a couple of 2 or 3 things that we did a lot of things right, but we did 2 or 3 things. Look, if I did it all over again, I would do it differently. But what parent in here who has adult children cannot say that? We all can, okay? Because you know things different now than you knew then. Of course, also we forget really what it was like when it was back then. Okay? And he said, why didn't I do that? Well, maybe because you were trying to survive, and because you didn't have any money, whatever it may have been. But you have to work through that, okay? So, the guilt, if you don't deal with your guilt, it will drive you to respond unwisely to your adult child, okay? But the same thing is true for children who have a guilty conscience before God. What often happens when adult children are guilty before God, they will then respond inappropriately towards their parents, especially if the parents are trying to live for God, because they will be convicted by your righteousness. So the Bible says in John 3 that men love darkness than light because their deeds are evil. And so a lot of times an adult child will ostracize who is not godly, who is a backslidden Christian, or maybe someone who's rejected Christianity or a backslidden Christian, will actually ostracize their godly parents which can create all kinds of challenges, okay, in the relationship. But you have to, so guilt, when it's not properly dealt with, becomes a problem. And the way to deal with it is by dealing with it between God, you and God, between you and others, and by resting upon grace. And when it's there, but it's not your thing, it's the other person's thing, you can't do a thing about it except pray and ask God to work it out. You can't force other people to get right with their sin. Okay? The second word is, before I give it to you, let's turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 13, which will make the word easy to find, to figure out. But look at 1 Corinthians chapter 13. But there's a specific way that this word is important. So the word is love, okay? That the way we deal with our children has to be motivated out of love. But there's a couple of specific, 5 of them, specific components or dynamics or realities of love that need to be understood in relation to the parent-child relationship, particularly if you're parenting adult children. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 13, and look at verses 6 and 7. Rejoiceth not in iniquity, but rejoiceth in the truth. Beareth all things, believeth all things, hopeth all things, endureth all things. There is an enormous misunderstanding about the concept of love between adult children and their parents. Now, when I do my seminar, and many of you have heard the seminar, or at least parts of the seminar, I've got, I think, 6 or 7 messages on parenting adult children that I've done, seminars at churches and so forth. And so there are a lot of different angles you can go on this, but almost always, and I'm supposed to do the same kind of seminar at the Wilds next spring, if they have it. Nowadays, you don't know what's going to happen, but that's the plan. And their old people's meeting, the senior meeting that they have there. And so they've asked me to do it, so we're going to try it. And but anyhow, but in the presentation, at least at one of the sessions, I often will bring up the question, have you ever had your adult child say to you, what do you want for Christmas? And the way I set it up usually is I say that, if your adult child is 20 or 25 or 30 years old, and they call the average young adult like that, 20-something years old, and they call their parents, particularly if they're married and have young kids themselves, and they call their parents and say, well, what do you want for Christmas? What is the common response that many parents give? And what's the answer? Nothing, okay? And the reason why they say nothing is that they don't really hear the question. They don't hear the question. The question was not, do you have food in your refrigerator? Is your electricity about being cut off? What do you need that you can't buy yourself? That wasn't their question. Their question was this. When I was 7 and brought home this gunky, stupid stuff from school at Christmas time, you said, oh, it's so nice! And you fussed it. It was important to you that I showed you I loved you when I was 7. Is it no longer important to you that I express my love to you now? And if they get nothing, then they don't. Now, I'm not suggesting to you that the adult child really understands it fully themselves. Some of them do, some of them don't. But that's what you're doing. Usually you don't give Christmas gifts for people who are, people that you know, stuff that they're dying without. They're going without medicine, they're going without food, they have to have. You give them stuff you want to give them. Okay, something extra, okay, and show your love to them, okay? Now, I say that not to be critical and not to create guilt for you who have been saying nothing for years, okay? So I'm not trying to do that at all, okay? I'm just telling you, you have to think through that love relationship between a parent and their adult children, especially if the relationship is estranged or if it is distant for other reasons. So, some parent-child relationships are estranged because of issues, and some simply because of distance, and sometimes just of personality. I mean, there are some kids who, they're sort of like turtles. I mean, once they got born, they said, "I'm fine," and they go off on themselves. They just don't really. They don't have an emotional connection. You could have 5 different kids and have 5 different levels of emotional connection to mom and dad. It has nothing to do with how you raise them, but you look at their lives and they're not really connected to anybody else much either, And so you can have all those different reasons. So in that context, you got to think through the issue of love. Now, in these 2 verses, there are 5 dynamics of love. I'll give them to you very quickly. Letter A, the love needs to be righteous. In other words, it rejoices not in iniquity, but rejoices in the truth. So it's got to be righteous. So when Jack brings Jill home and they're living together, she's welcome to come and have Christmas dinner with us, and you may or may not be able to allow her to stay in your house in a separate room. You may not even be able to do that. That's a decision you have to make, okay? But they're not going to stay together because you can't rejoice in their sin. If Jack says, for example, he's married Jim. I'm quoting the word, putting married in quotation because Jack can't marry Jim, not biblically, not in real life. But in the make-believe world of our society, they can have a legal binding contract. So if Jack decides to marry Jim, as a Christian, I don't see how you go to the wedding. I don't see how you take part in any way that would affirm that behavior, okay? And so, but yet you have to still love Jack, and you got to help him to get right with God if he's backslidden Christian or if he's not saved, and you want the guy he's with to also get saved, because if they both get saved to get right with God, they're not going to stay in the relationship, okay? So that's what they need. But you have to respond righteously to them, okay? Letter B, you also have to decide mercifully. And it's important that parents of adult children not only be righteous, but be merciful. It's interesting that in verse 6, he emphasizes the righteousness of it, but look at the next verse 7, first phrase, beareth all things. And that means to support or protect or even cover up. And the idea is to have the idea of mercy, of idea of being merciful to them. And so what you can let go, you let go. You don't hold all offenses. There may be things that really you think they should deal with, but you're able to let it go because love covers a multitude of sins. And people are different. And that's particularly true with in-laws. Son-in-laws and sister-in-laws are just different. The son-in-laws are usually not like maybe you're used to, and the daughter-in-laws are not what you're used to, because everybody's different, okay? And they do things like their family did things. And you hear about it, you say, well, that's not the way it's supposed to be done. I mean, who ever heard of having Christmas without spaghetti sauce, meatballs, and eggs? I mean, I've never heard of that. My whole existence, I've never understood that having Christmas, what it's like to have Christmas and meatballs and spaghetti not being part of the celebration. It's like not having a Christmas tree. But you might not realize this, but not everybody's that way. And when your kids start marrying into other families, they bring other traditions. It's just different. Now, I'm using that as a silly, simple illustration, but sometimes it can be more severe than that. Or that's not severe, but something severe that completely different in like their personalities, how they do things, and how they want to interact. So you have to be careful of that, and some of those things are just irritations, and some of them may not be the best way to do something, but you have to accept it because you're the in-law. Okay? If you're the mother-in-law, if you have a daughter-in-law, you got to be really careful. Okay? If you got a daughter-in-law, you got to be really careful that you don't infringe upon that lady's boundaries for her house. Right? Okay, that's just the way it is. Now, if you have a son-in-law, you have to be really careful that you don't undermine his role in the life of your daughter. What's wrong with your husband? Is he an idiot? Why is he doing this? Okay? Now, again, none of y'all would say that, but I know people that would say that. They're trying. I'm trying to help my daughter because her husband's messing things up. Well, it is her husband, and he outranks you. You know that. I don't have any son-in-laws, so I don't have that issue. But because I have 2 sons, but they outrank you. They outrank you, so you better be careful that you don't diminish their role in how you respond to them. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind. And then letter C, there needs to be affirming love. The phrase "believeth all things." Calvin wrote this about that phrase: "It is always ready to think the best, to put the most favorable construction on anything." You always just think the best of them. I really love this one. You believe all things. And that's why when you're dealing with your adult children, particularly if they ask you advice, you always end it by saying to them, "I am confident you're going to make the right decision." Now, are they going to always make the right decision? Of course they're not. But neither do you. Neither do I. But they need that affirmation. And nothing means more to a grown child and particularly a young man or man, but a woman also, than the affirmation that they are adults by their parents. In our society, we don't have a ceremony people go through to mark their manhood. You know, you go bag a big deer, or you have some kind of ceremony you go through, and now you're a man or now you're a woman. We don't have that. But a parent that is affirming in their love can really go a long way to helping the child deal with that. Letter D, a confident love, hope with all things. Okay, that you always think that things are going to work out, that it's going to work out. It's going to be all right. Now, that confident love isn't silly love. You're at the hospital and they just told you someone passed away. It was not going to change. But you're confident in your love. And then finally, you're enduring. The last phrase in verse 7, endure with all things. The enduring is a military term, which means you hold your post and you stay there. Now, what do adult children need? They need the parent to say, you know what, you may or may not access what I have to offer to you, but I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to love you. I'm committed to this relationship. You may come and go. You may respond and not respond, but I'm going to be here. I'm not going anywhere. Okay? So we have to love. The third one, take your Bibles, turn to Titus chapter 2. Titus 2, I'll give you the third word, and the next two will be very short, but just give them to you. Titus chapter 2 and verse number 2. Well, verse 1. We'll start in verse 1. But speak thou the things which become sound doctrine, that the aged men, those are the more mature men, age-wise, be sober, grave, temperate, sound in faith, in charity, in patience. Okay? That we do that. That we have this example. Here's the third one. The third word is example. That he says here that an older man should be sober, which means to be vigilant in their thinking. Should be grave, which means they're serious-minded. They should be temperate, which means they're self-controlled. They're sound in the faith. They are sound biblically. They are loving people. Love is governing them, and they are patient. Okay? Now, what he's describing here is this, that when you get old, you need to make sure you're still exhibiting the Christian life that God would have the younger people to live. How is a 40-year-old, or 20-year-old, or a 40-year-old going to learn how to be a 60-year-old or even an 80-year-old godly husband or father or man? The example that we set. But in our culture, what we've been taught is that when the kids grow up, they're gone. So, have your second childhood. This is your time. The kids are gone. You've raised your kids. Now this is your time. Do what you want to do. Be with it. And that's why a lot of people, they trade their partners for somebody else. They say, well, they've done their part and they've gone through they think the finish line is getting the kids out of the house, graduate from college maybe, and in their careers, out of the house, and now it's my time. Let me go spend my money on myself. Let me just do what I want to do. Let's see how much fun I can have. Okay? We went a number of years ago to the seniors conference at the Wilds, and Brother Sweat, he's pastor emeritus now down in South Carolina, where we're going to be having in Georgia, where we're having our next FBFI meeting, he spoke, and he gave an awesome focus on grandparents investing themselves in the lives of their grandchildren and their children. Instead of taking their money, because not always, but a lot of times when you're at that age, you have a bit more discretionary money, okay? So you can go do this trip and that trip, and this may be this thing or buy this thing and that thing. And he was just advocating the wisdom, instead of maybe doing all of that as much, not that you don't do it at all, but as much, or saving a bunch of money to give to your kids after you're dead, that you spend the money and invest it in their life and share the experiences with them. I thought it was pretty cool, okay? That's been our philosophy. So just trying to do that, and it helps when your kids are halfway around the world because it costs so much to go, and do the time with them. But it is what it is, okay? And so, but the example here The example of God, and then in look at verse 3. The aged women likewise, that they behave themselves and become in holiness, not false accusers, not giving them much wine, teachers of good things. He's saying, look, when you get older, you need to still be a good example. And we need to ask ourselves the question, as men and women who are older and have adult children, are we living the life that God would want our son or daughter to live at this stage? Are we living the life that our daughter-in-laws or son-in-laws would hope that their husband or respective wife, our children, would be living at this age? Okay? Are we showing our grandkids how to be faithful to the end in our personal holiness? And the last word, I put them together. I'm not going to deal with the passage. I'm going to give it to you. It's for your homework assignment if you want to use it. Number 4, if we're done. Number 4, the influence and patience. Because you're going to be patient in giving the influence. I'm going to give you 2 references because we've dealt with this at length before. One is Exodus chapter 18, and the second is Luke chapter 16. The one in Exodus 18 is Jethro giving his advice to Moses, and how he gave his life to him, and how he reached out and ministered to him and gave himself to him. The other one is in Luke 15, not 16, Luke 15, the prodigal son's father. In both cases, they influenced their child for good, one by giving advice in Exodus 18, the other by creating an environment where the child could experience the consequences of his sin and then come back to him. But we need to have influence and patience. So those 4 things. So hopefully that helped you tonight. If you have adult children, or if you have your parents still alive, that you'll understand them better, and it might be a help to us.